Sometimes life teaches us that the sweetest revenge is simply showing people who they really are. And when I discovered that my own 3 sons saw me as nothing more than a burden to be managed, I never imagined that this painful realization would lead to the most satisfying year of my entire life. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Grandma Maggie. I'm 85 years old today, and my heart is full of stories to tell you. Before I start this story that completely changed my life, I'd like to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's such a joy to know that my stories reach so many different places. Today I'm going to tell you how I went from being treated like a helpless widow to teaching my ungrateful children the most important lesson of their lives. This story begins 20 years ago, here in Hartford, Connecticut, when I was 65 and thought I knew everything about the people I had raised with my own hands. It was a Sunday afternoon in March when everything started to unravel. I was in my small kitchen in the modest neighborhood where I'd lived since my dear Harold passed away, preparing my famous pot roast for our weekly family dinner. The aroma of herbs and slow-cooked meat filled the tiny space, mixing with the sound of rain tapping against the old windows. I had set the table with my best china, the one Harold gave me for our 20th anniversary, hoping to make this Sunday special because my 3 boys had all received promotions at the same company where they worked. The house felt warm and inviting, with fresh flowers from my little garden brightening the worn furniture that had served our family for decades. Robert, my eldest at 42, always arrived first with his wife Patricia, both of them wearing clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Patricia would kiss my cheek with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, while Robert immediately loosened his expensive tie and settled into Harold's old recliner like he owned the place. Michael, the middle child at 39, came with his designer briefcase, checking his phone constantly, as if the world would stop without his immediate attention. His wife Jennifer usually stayed home with their twin boys, claiming they were too busy with soccer practice and piano lessons to visit their grandmother. And Danny, my baby at 35, charmed his way through the door with that smile that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5 years old, bringing his latest girlfriend who would spend the entire meal looking bored and checking her watch. The conversation during dinner always followed the same pattern. They would talk about their work, their success, their important meetings and business deals, while I served them the food I had spent all day preparing. I would ask questions about their lives, and they would answer with the kind of patience you reserve for a child who doesn't understand adult matters. When I tried to share news about my neighbors or my volunteer work at the local community center, their eyes would glaze over with polite disinterest. What I didn't expect that particular Sunday was to overhear their conversation while I was in the kitchen getting dessert ready. They thought I couldn't hear them in the living room, but the thin walls of my little house carried their voices perfectly to where I stood frozen, holding a tray of apple pie that suddenly felt too heavy for my trembling hands. "Mom's getting worse," Robert was saying in that authoritative tone he'd developed since becoming successful. "Did you see how she struggled to understand when I was explaining the quarterly projections?" She just nodded and smiled like she always does, but there was nothing behind her eyes. "It's like talking to a wall. She's becoming a liability," Michael added, his voice cold and analytical as always. "We need to start thinking about assisted living before she does something dangerous. Living alone in this dump, she could fall and hurt herself. Or worse, leave the stove on and burn the whole neighborhood down." Patricia's voice joined the conversation with that fake concern she had perfected. "I've been researching facilities, and there are some really nice places about an hour outside the city. Not too expensive, but clean and safe. The kind of place where she'd have activities and people her own age to talk to." But it was Danny's words that cut deepest into my heart. "The worst part is how embarrassing it is when clients ask about family. What am I supposed to say? That my mother lives in a run-down neighborhood, clips coupons and thinks $100 dinner is expensive? It reflects poorly on all of us. Makes us look like we don't take care of our own family. At least if she's in a facility, Robert continued, we can tell people she's being properly cared for. And honestly, it would be a relief not to have to worry about these Sunday dinners anymore. I have better things to do with my weekends than listen to stories about Mrs. Henderson's cat. Michael laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Remember last month when she tried to give me investment advice? Investment advice? As if a woman who's never owned a stock in her life could understand portfolio management. I just smiled and nodded, but honestly, it was painful to watch. I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life spent caring for them. The photo gallery of their childhood achievements covering one entire wall. The recipe box filled with their favorite meals written in my careful handwriting. The drawer full of birthday cards they'd given me over the years with generic messages about loving mothers. For 20 years since Harold's passing, I had played the role of the struggling widow, accepting their occasional financial help with carefully manufactured gratitude, listening to their condescending advice about managing my simple finances, and pretending to be impressed by their busy, important lives that rarely included time for their mother. The apple pie in my hands grew heavier as I listened to them discuss my future like I was a piece of furniture to be moved around for their convenience. They had already decided that I was a burden, an embarrassment, a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. Every Sunday dinner, every phone call, every interaction we'd had for the past 2 decades suddenly took on a different meaning. They weren't visiting their mother out of love. They were checking on their obligation. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room or anywhere else knew, except my lawyer and accountant, was that I owned the very company where they worked. Hartwell Real Estate Holdings wasn't just any business empire. It was my life's work, built alongside Harold during our 40-year marriage and expanded by me alone after his passing. Through a complex network of subsidiary companies, holding corporations, and carefully managed investments, I controlled over 60% of Hartford's commercial real estate market. The modest house where they were sitting, dismissing their mother as a simpleton, was just one of over 300 properties I owned throughout Connecticut. The careful budgeting they mocked was a choice, not a necessity. The simple clothes I wore, the generic groceries I bought, the second-hand furniture that filled my home. It had all been an elaborate test that had been running for 20 years. When Harold died, I could have revealed my business acumen immediately. I could have moved into the penthouse apartment I owned downtown, driven the luxury cars sitting in a garage across town, worn the designer clothes hanging in a closet they'd never seen. Instead, I chose to see who my sons really were when they thought their mother had nothing to offer them except inconvenience and obligation. Standing in that kitchen, listening to them plan my involuntary institutionalization, I finally had my answer. The test was over, and they had failed more spectacularly than I ever could have imagined. As I walked back into the living room with the pie, my hands perfectly steady despite the storm raging in my chest, I smiled at my 3 successful sons and made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. They wanted to see what their helpless old mother was really capable of. They were about to find out, and the education was going to be more thorough than anything they'd learned in their expensive business schools. The next morning, I woke up in my small bedroom and looked around at the deliberately modest surroundings with new eyes. The worn carpet, the mismatched furniture, the outdated wallpaper. All of it had served its purpose. For 20 years, this house had been my laboratory, and my sons had been my unwitting test subjects. Now it was time to analyze the results and publish my findings. I made my coffee in the same chipped mug I'd used for years, but today it tasted different. Everything tasted different when you finally stopped pretending to be someone you weren't. I called my assistant Janet, who had been helping me manage my business affairs from the shadows for years, maintaining the fiction that I was just another elderly client who needed help with simple paperwork. "Janet, dear," I said, settling into Harold's old chair with my coffee. "I need you to schedule a meeting with the head of human resources at Hartwell Industries. And please, make sure it's during regular business hours when my sons will be in the building. It's time they met their real boss." Janet's delighted laughter filled my ear. She had been waiting for this day almost as long as I had, watching me endure their condescending treatment during the occasional times they'd encountered her at my house. "Oh, Mrs. Hartwell, this is going to be something to see. Shall I prepare the files we've been keeping on their performance?" "All of them," I confirmed. 20 years of documentation should be sufficient to paint a complete picture. What my boys didn't realize was that their mother had been watching them much more closely than they'd been watching her. I knew about Robert's habit of padding his expense reports, charging personal dinners to the company account, and claiming them as client meetings that never happened. I had copies of restaurant receipts where he'd entertained his golf buddies and written off thousands of dollars as business expenses. I knew about Michael's tendency to delegate all his actual work to junior employees, while taking credit for their ideas in presentations to senior management. I had recorded conversations where he'd stolen proposals from subordinates and presented them as his own innovations, destroying careers while building his own reputation. And I knew about Danny's creative interpretation of his sales numbers, inflating figures and pushing through deals that barely met company standards, while claiming commissions for work done by his team. I had a documentation of clients who had complained about his aggressive tactics and unethical practices. For the next 3 months, I quietly gathered additional evidence while maintaining my role as the helpless widow who needed their guidance and protection. I installed security cameras in my own house, not to spy on strangers, but to document my own children's behavior when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The cameras revealed disturbing patterns. Robert would go through my mail when he thought I was napping, clearly looking for bank statements or insurance documents that might reveal assets he didn't know about. Michael would photograph important papers on my desk when I left the room to get refreshments, building his own dossier of my financial information. Danny would charm information out of me about my daily routines, my health concerns, and my relationships with neighbors. Information that I later overheard him sharing with his brothers as evidence of my declining competence. I hired a private investigator, not to spy on strangers, but to document my own children's activities during work hours. The investigator, a former police detective named Marcus, who specialized in corporate misconduct, was initially puzzled by my request to surveillance my own family members. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said during our first meeting at a coffee shop downtown, far from my neighborhood where my sons might see us, "I have to ask why you want to investigate your own children. This is highly unusual." "Mr. Marcus," I replied, "I need to know who they really are when they think nobody is watching. I need documentation of their character, their work ethic, and their treatment of other people. Can you provide that?" His investigation over the following months painted a picture that broke my heart, but strengthened my resolve. Robert spent most afternoons at expensive bars, networking with competitors and sharing confidential company information in exchange for personal favors. He had developed relationships with real estate agents from rival firms, passing along details about Hartwell's development plans in exchange for insider tips on their projects. Michael had been systematically bullying junior employees, creating a toxic work environment that had led to several resignations and at least 2 formal complaints to human resources that had somehow been buried. He would publicly humiliate subordinates in meetings, steal their ideas, and then write negative performance reviews that prevented them from advancing within the company. Danny was having an affair with a married client, using company resources to fund their meetings at luxury hotels, and charging the expenses to fictitious business accounts. He had also been falsifying his sales reports, claiming credit for deals that had been closed by other team members, and inflating his commission calculations. But the final straw came during our Sunday dinner in June. The weather was beautiful, and I had opened all the windows to let in the fresh air. I had prepared their favorite meal, glazed ham with all the traditional sides, and set the table with extra care, using cloth napkins and the good silverware. I had even bought a cake from the expensive bakery downtown, thinking it would be a nice surprise. Patricia arrived wearing a new dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and she made a comment that she probably thought was subtle. "Maggie, honey, have you thought about what you'll do when this house becomes too much for you? I mean, the neighborhood is changing, and it might be dangerous for a woman your age to be alone. Just last week, Jennifer heard there was a break-in just 2 streets over." Michael jumped in immediately, as if they had rehearsed this conversation. "We've actually been looking at some really nice facilities. There's one about an hour outside the city that specializes in memory care. They have beautiful gardens and organized activities. You'd love it there, Mom." "Memory care?" I asked, keeping my voice deliberately shaky and confused. "But I don't have any problems with my memory. I remember everything just fine." "Of course not, Mom," Danny said with that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate, reaching over to pat my hand like I was a confused child. "But it's never too early to plan ahead. These places have waiting lists, and the good ones fill up fast. We're just looking out for your future well-being." Robert cleared his throat in that self-important way he'd developed, clearly preparing to deliver what he considered the final word on the subject. "Mom, we've been discussing this as a family, and we think it would be best if you started preparing for the transition. We can help you sort through your things, decide what to keep and what to donate. The house needs work that you can't afford, and frankly, we're worried about you living alone." "We've already talked to a realtor," Patricia added, apparently thinking this news would be welcome. "The housing market is good right now, and even though this neighborhood isn't the best, you should be able to get enough from the sale to cover the facility costs for several years." They had already decided my future without consulting me. They had already contacted professionals about selling my home and moving me into institutional care. They had already written me off as a burden to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. That night, after they left my house discussing my situation, as if I couldn't hear them from the front porch, I called my lawyer. "Richard," I said to the man who had handled my affairs for 30 years, "it's time to remind my sons that their mother isn't as helpless as they think. I want to schedule a board meeting for next month, and I want my sons to attend. It's time for them to meet the real Margaret Hartwell." Richard had been waiting for this call for 2 decades. He had watched me endure their treatment with growing frustration, offering multiple times to reveal my true financial status and put an end to their condescending behavior. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "It will be my absolute pleasure to arrange this meeting. Should I prepare termination documents as well?" "Let's see how they handle the revelation first," I replied. "But yes, have everything ready. If they're going to treat their mother like a business problem to be solved, they should learn what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a real business decision." The plan I developed over the summer was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of confronting them directly at home, where they could dismiss my anger as senile ranting, I would let them reveal their true characters to themselves and everyone around them in the professional environment where they felt most confident and secure. First, I arranged for an internal audit of their department, something that happened routinely, but that I could ensure would be particularly thorough. I wanted documentation of every policy violation, every ethical lapse, every instance of misconduct that I suspected but needed to prove. Second, I began attending company events in disguise, using my maiden name and claiming to be considering a major investment in the company. I wanted to see my sons in their professional environment, to witness firsthand how they treated colleagues and clients when they thought no family was watching. The first event I attended was a networking mixer in July, held at one of Hartford's most exclusive hotels. I dressed expensively but conservatively, with my hair styled differently and makeup that subtly changed the shape of my face. I introduced myself as Margaret Thompson, a widow considering diversifying her late husband's portfolio with real estate investments. What I saw that night confirmed every suspicion I had harbored and exceeded my worst expectations. Robert dismissed ideas from female colleagues, interrupting them in meetings and claiming their suggestions as his own. When a young woman tried to present a proposal for sustainable development, he cut her off mid-sentence and began explaining why environmental concerns were secondary to profit margins, clearly trying to impress what he thought was a potential investor. Michael treated support staff like servants, snapping his fingers at waiters and becoming visibly annoyed when his drink order took more than 2 minutes to arrive. He spoke to the hotel's event coordinator with such condescension that I saw her eyes fill with tears, and when she made a small mistake with the presentation setup, he berated her loudly enough for half the room to hear. Danny made inappropriate comments to every attractive woman in attendance, including married clients and junior employees who clearly felt uncomfortable, but were too intimidated to speak up. I watched him corner a young marketing assistant by the bar, standing too close and making remarks about her appearance that had nothing to do with business. They were my sons, and despite everything, part of me had hoped they would prove me wrong. Part of me wanted them to show kindness, integrity, or at least basic respect for others when they thought their mother wasn't watching. Instead, they exceeded my worst expectations and confirmed that their treatment of me wasn't an aberration. It was a pattern of behavior that extended to everyone they considered beneath them, but I wasn't ready to act yet. I needed more documentation, more evidence, more proof that their behavior wasn't just a bad night, but a consistent pattern of misconduct that warranted serious consequences. Over the following months, I attended 3 more company events and witnessed the same patterns of behavior repeated. Robert's arrogance and ethical violations, Michael's bullying and idea theft, Danny's inappropriate conduct and dishonesty. It was all documented, recorded, and carefully catalogued. The audit results came back in September, and they were even more damning than I had expected. Robert's expense irregularities totaled over $75,000 in inappropriate charges over the past 2 years alone. The auditors had found evidence of systematic abuse of company resources, including charges for personal vacations, family dinners, and gifts for his wife that had been disguised as business expenses. Michael's department had the highest turnover rate in the company, with exit interviews citing hostile management as the primary reason for resignations. The human resources director, who knew me only as the company owner and had no idea I was related to the employees in question, shared details of complaints that had been filed but never properly investigated due to Michael's skill at manipulating the internal review process. Danny's sales figures, when examined closely by forensic accountants, revealed a pattern of misrepresentation that bordered on fraud. He had been double billing clients, claiming commissions for work done by team members, and inflating property values in reports to buyers who trusted his expertise. As October arrived with its brilliant foliage painting Hartford in shades of gold and crimson, I prepared for the final phase of my plan. My sons had no idea that their quiet, struggling mother was about to step out of the shadows and show them exactly what power looked like when wielded by someone who had earned it through decades of hard work, ethical business practices, and respect for others. The weekly Sunday dinners continued, with my sons becoming increasingly bold in their discussions of my future. They had found a facility they liked. They informed me over pot roast and mashed potatoes. They had spoken to someone about selling my house and had already received a preliminary assessment of its value. They had even contacted my doctor about getting documentation for my declining cognitive abilities, though they were careful not to mention that they had lied to him about symptoms I didn't have. I nodded and smiled, just as they expected me to, while inside I counted down the days until they would discover that the helpless old woman they were planning to warehouse had been in control all along. Every condescending pat on the hand, every simplified explanation of complex topics I understood better than they did, every dismissive glance when I tried to contribute to conversations, I stored it all away as fuel for what was coming. The transformation began on a cold November morning when I walked into the executive offices of Hartwell Real Estate Holdings, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and carrying myself with the bearing of someone who had built an empire from nothing. For 20 years, I had been invisible in my own company, working through intermediaries and maintaining my anonymity, while watching from the shadows as the business I had created grew and prospered. But today, I was claiming my rightful place as the founder and majority owner of one of Hartford's most successful businesses. The receptionist, a young woman named Amy, who had worked for the company for 3 years, didn't recognize me when I approached her desk. This was exactly as planned. I had been careful to ensure that my public identity as a struggling widow never intersected with my private role as a business owner. "Good morning," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had every right to be there. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock board meeting. I'm Margaret Hartwell." Amy's eyes widened as she recognized the name from company documents and internal communications. She had heard about the mysterious founder who owned the company, but had never met her. "Oh, Mrs. Hartwell. Of course, they're expecting you in the conference room. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be lovely, thank you," I replied, enjoying the respectful tone that I hadn't heard from my own family in 20 years. Black, no sugar. The executive floor was everything I had designed it to be. Professional, elegant, and successful. The conference room where board meetings were held was equipped with the latest technology, surrounded by windows that offered panoramic views of the Hartford skyline, and furnished with a table that could seat 20 people comfortably. When I entered the room at exactly 10 o'clock, conversations stopped, and all eyes turned toward me. Board members who had been expecting a routine quarterly review suddenly found themselves face to face with the legendary founder they had heard about, but never met. But I wasn't there for them. I was there for the presentation scheduled to begin at 10:30, when the heads of all major departments would report on their progress and challenges. "Good morning, everyone," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table, a position that had remained empty during all previous meetings out of respect for the absent founder. I apologize for the surprise, but I felt it was time to take a more active role in the company's operations. The board members introduced themselves, though I knew them all from quarterly reports and financial statements. They were good people who had helped grow my business while respecting my desire for privacy. Now they were finally meeting the woman whose vision and leadership had created the foundation for their success. At 10:25, the department heads began filing into the room for their quarterly presentations. I watched through the glass walls as employees throughout the office noticed the unusual activity in the conference room and began speculating about what was happening. Some of them recognized me from company photos and historical documents, but most had no idea who I was. My 3 sons arrived with their colleagues at exactly 10:30, each of them confident and comfortable in their professional environment. Robert carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed he was indispensable to the company's success. Michael had his usual stack of reports and charts, ready to impress with numbers and analysis that he had likely stolen from subordinates. Danny flashed his charming smile at the female board members, completely unaware that his behavior was being noted and recorded. They took their seats at the far end of the table, still engaged in conversation about a client meeting they had scheduled for later that afternoon. They didn't notice me at first, seated at the head of the table with the morning sun behind me, surrounded by board members who were watching them with expressions of professional interest mixed with barely concealed anticipation. It wasn't until the meeting officially began, and I was introduced as the company's founder and majority shareholder, that three familiar faces turned toward me with expressions of complete and utter shock. The silence that followed my introduction was deafening. I watched as understanding dawned on their faces. First confusion, then recognition, then panic, as they realized the implications of my presence. Every conversation they'd had about me, every dismissive comment about their struggling mother, every plan they'd made for my future without my consent, it all took on a different meaning now that they understood who I really was. Robert's face went completely white, and I saw his hands trembling as he reached for his water glass. Michael's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing the fear underneath his professional facade. Danny's charming smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of dawning horror as he began to understand the magnitude of their situation. But I wasn't finished. In fact, I was just getting started. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm and professional as I addressed the room full of department heads and senior managers. "I'm Margaret Hartwell, founder and majority owner of Hartwell Real Estate Holdings. I believe some of you know my sons, Robert, Michael, and Daniel, who work in our development division." The silence stretched on as everyone in the room processed this information. Some of the board members were smiling slightly, clearly enjoying the drama that was unfolding. Other department heads looked confused, trying to understand why the company owner was introducing her own family members as if they were strangers. "I've been observing our company culture from a unique perspective over the past several months," I continued, opening the folder that contained documentation of their misconduct. "And I've noticed some concerning patterns that need to be addressed immediately." What followed was the most satisfying hour of my professional life. I presented the audit findings with the calm professionalism of someone who had been running businesses longer than my sons had been alive. I detailed their expense irregularities, their treatment of subordinates, their ethical lapses, and their general failure to uphold the standards that had made Hartwell Real Estate a respected name in Hartford for over 4 decades. Robert tried to interrupt with explanations and justifications, but I held up a hand that silenced him immediately. "Mr. Hartwell," I said, using his formal name and title, "you'll have an opportunity to respond when I've finished presenting the evidence." Michael attempted to shift blame to his subordinates, claiming that any problems in his department were the result of poor performance by junior employees. But the documentation was too thorough for deflection, and several board members had witnessed his treatment of staff at company events. Danny turned on the charm that had always worked with his mother, flashing that smile and trying to minimize his violations as minor misunderstandings. But he was no longer talking to the woman who had raised him with unconditional love. He was facing a CEO who was immune to manipulation and focused solely on protecting her company's reputation and values. "Effective immediately," I announced to the room after presenting 45 minutes of documented evidence. "Robert Hartwell, Michael Hartwell, and Daniel Hartwell are terminated from their positions for violations of company policy, ethical misconduct, and behavior incompatible with our organizational values." The shock on their faces was worth every moment of the past 20 years of pretending to be helpless. But more importantly, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The pure satisfaction of standing up for myself, protecting my employees, and demanding the respect I deserved. Security escorted them from the building while I remained in the conference room, fielding questions from board members who suddenly understood why the company had been so successful for so long. The woman they had heard about in whispers and rumors, the mysterious founder who had built an empire while raising 3 children, as a single mother after her husband's early death, was finally revealing herself to the world. "Mrs. Hartwell," asked Janet Morrison, the head of human resources, "how long have you known about their behavior?" "Long enough," I replied. And I apologized to everyone who had to work with them during that time. No employee should have to tolerate harassment, bullying, or unethical conduct from management. The questions continued for another hour as we discussed the immediate steps needed to address the toxic culture that my sons had created in their department. I authorized employee counseling services for anyone who had been affected by their behavior, implemented new reporting procedures to prevent similar situations in the future, and announced my intention to take a more active role in day-to-day operations. That evening, I returned to my modest house in the quiet neighborhood, but everything was different now. I was no longer playing a role or hiding my true identity. I was Margaret Hartwell, successful businesswoman, mother, and grandmother, and I was done being treated like a burden by anyone, especially my own children. The phone started ringing before I even got my coat off. Robert called first, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just fire us. We're your sons. This is insane." "Robert," I replied calmly, "you're absolutely right. You are my sons, which makes your behavior even more disappointing than if you had been strangers. I raised you to be better than this." "Better than what?" he shouted. "We've been successful. We've been supporting you. We've been taking care of you." "Supporting me?" I laughed, a sound without humor. "Robert, I haven't needed your support for 20 years. I've been testing you, and you failed spectacularly." Michael called 20 minutes later, trying the logical approach that had always been his preferred method of manipulation. "Mom, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. This isn't rational behavior. You need help, and we're going to get it for you. You can't destroy our careers because you're confused about business." "Michael," I said, "I've been running businesses since before you were born. There's nothing confused about holding employees accountable for their actions. You treated your subordinates terribly, and now you're facing the consequences. Those people don't matter," he snapped, revealing his true character more clearly than any audit could have. "They're just employees. We're your family." "Family doesn't treat each other the way you've been treating me," I replied. "And successful businesses don't retain employees who abuse their co-workers, regardless of their family connections." Danny was the last to call, and his approach was pure emotional manipulation. "Mom, please, you're killing me here. I know we haven't been perfect, but we love you. We were just trying to protect you. Can't we work this out? Can't we be a family again?" "Danny," I said, "if you love me, you wouldn't have spent 20 years treating me like I was stupid. If you wanted to protect me, you wouldn't have planned to have me committed to a facility against my will. And if you wanted to be a family, you would have included me in decisions about my own life." The calls continued throughout the night and into the following days. Sometimes they were angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening legal action. Patricia called to accuse me of destroying her family out of spite. Michael's wife, Jennifer, threatened to prevent me from seeing my grandchildren. Danny's latest girlfriend, whom I had met exactly twice, somehow felt qualified to lecture me about family loyalty and forgiveness. But there was one voice that mattered more than all the others combined. Sarah, my 16-year-old granddaughter and Robert's only child, showed up at my door on a Saturday morning in December with tears in her eyes and a question that broke my heart all over again. "Grandma Maggie," she said, "why didn't you tell us you were rich? Why did you let Dad think you needed help?" I invited her into my small living room and made hot chocolate the way I had when she was little, with marshmallows and whipped cream and a dollop of vanilla ice cream that made it more like a dessert than a drink. As she sat at my kitchen table, the same table where her father had eaten countless meals while planning my involuntary retirement, I tried to explain something that even adults were struggling to understand. "Honey," I said, settling into the chair across from her, "I wasn't hiding money from you or your father. I was trying to find out who loved me for myself, not for what I could give them. I wanted to know if your father and uncles would respect me and include me in their lives, even if they thought I had nothing to offer them. But that's not fair," Sarah said, wiping her eyes with the tissue I handed her. "You lied to them. You made them think you needed help. Did I?" I asked gently. "Sarah, when have I ever asked your father for money? When have I ever said I needed help with anything? I accepted the help they offered, but I never requested it. And more importantly, I never asked them to make decisions about my life without including me in those decisions." She was quiet for a long time, processing this information with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes easier to young people than to adults, trapped in patterns of behavior and expectation. "Dad says you've ruined everything," she whispered finally. "He says we might have to move because he can't find another job that pays as well. Mom is talking about divorce. Everyone's angry all the time. Your father is a smart man with good education and years of experience," I replied carefully. "He'll find work when he starts treating people with respect and taking responsibility for his actions. But Sarah, I need you to understand something very important. The way your father and uncles treated me wasn't love. It was control." "What do you mean?" she asked. "They wanted to make decisions about my life without including me in those decisions. They wanted to put me in a facility without asking if that's what I wanted. They spoke about me like I wasn't capable of understanding my own situation. That's not how people treat someone they respect and love." Sarah nodded slowly, and I could see her connecting this explanation to things she had witnessed, but not fully understood. "Is that why you fired them? Because they didn't respect you?" "I fired them because they were behaving unethically at work," I said. "They were treating their co-workers the same way they treated me, like people whose opinions and feelings didn't matter. That's not the kind of behavior I want associated with my company. Will you help them?" she asked finally, and I could hear the hope in her voice that somehow I could fix everything and make her family whole again. "I will always love them," I said, "but I won't enable them to continue treating people badly. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their choices. Your father and uncles need to learn that their actions have impacts on other people." "What about me?" she asked, and the vulnerability in her voice reminded me that she was still just a child caught in the middle of adult conflicts. "What happens to me if Mom and Dad get divorced and Dad can't find a job?" I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "Sarah, no matter what happens between your parents, you will always be my granddaughter, and I will always make sure you're taken care of. Your education, your future, your dreams, none of that has to change because of the choices your father made." The relief on her face was immediate and profound. "Really? You promise?" "I promise," I said. "And Sarah, I hope you'll come visit me sometimes, not because you have to, but because you want to. I'd like to get to know the person you're becoming, and I'd like you to know who I really am." She stayed for lunch that day, and we talked about her school, her friends, her plans for college, and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. For the first time in years, I had a conversation with a family member that wasn't strained by pretense or colored by condescension. She treated me like an intelligent adult whose opinions and experiences mattered, and I realized how much I had missed that kind of interaction. Christmas that year was the loneliest and most peaceful I'd experienced in decades. None of my sons came to dinner, and their wives made sure my other grandchildren were otherwise occupied. But I didn't spend the day feeling sorry for myself or regretting my decisions. Instead, I drove to 3 different homeless shelters and served meals to people who understood what it meant to need help and accept it gracefully. The contrast was striking. The people at the shelters thanked me genuinely for my time and service. They treated me with respect and dignity, even though many of them had nothing to offer in return. They included me in conversations, asked about my life, and shared stories from their own experiences. It was the kind of interaction I had been craving from my own family for 20 years. As the new year approached, I made another decision that surprised everyone who thought they knew me. I put my modest house on the market and moved into the penthouse apartment I had owned downtown for 15 years but never lived in. If I was going to stop hiding who I was, I reasoned, I might as well live like the successful woman I had always been. The apartment was everything my little house was not: spacious, modern, luxurious, and filled with amenities that reflected my true financial status. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Connecticut River, a view of the Hartford skyline that included buildings I owned, and enough space to entertain dozens of people comfortably. For the first time in 20 years, I decorated my home with the expensive art and furnishings that I could afford, and that brought me joy. I hired a housekeeper, not because I couldn't clean for myself, but because I could afford to pay someone else to do it and I had better things to do with my time. I bought new clothes that fit properly and reflected my personal style, rather than the image of a struggling widow I had been maintaining. I traded my old reliable car for something more comfortable and appropriate for a successful businesswoman. I started eating at restaurants I enjoyed rather than limiting myself to places that fit my fictional budget. The physical changes in my environment reflected deeper changes in my sense of self. I stopped apologizing for my success, stopped diminishing my achievements, and stopped accepting disrespectful treatment from anyone. I had spent so many years making myself smaller to make other people comfortable that I had forgotten what it felt like to take up space in the world. My social life changed dramatically as well. I started attending charity galas and cultural events, donating money to causes I cared about, and meeting people who valued intelligence and accomplishment over family connections or social status. I discovered that there was an entire community of successful older women in Hartford who had been invisible to me when I was pretending to struggle financially. These women became my friends in a way that I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. They treated me as an equal, sought my advice on business matters, and included me in their social activities because they enjoyed my company, not because they felt obligated to include me. For the first time in decades, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Spring brought news that my 3 sons had found new employment, though at significantly lower salaries and with less prestigious companies than they had left. Robert was working for a small real estate firm in the suburbs, handling residential sales rather than the commercial development he had specialized in. Michael had taken a position with a non-profit organization that focused on affordable housing, a dramatic change from his previous work with luxury developments. Danny was selling insurance for a national company, starting over at the bottom of the sales hierarchy. I also learned through the Hartford business community that Patricia had filed for divorce, citing financial stress and emotional incompatibility. According to mutual acquaintances, she had been unwilling to adjust her lifestyle to match Robert's reduced income and had grown tired of his anger and blame toward everyone but himself. Michael's wife, Jennifer, had started marriage counseling with him, though the outcome remained uncertain. From what I heard through Sarah, who still visited me regularly, Jennifer was struggling with the changes in their financial situation and Michael's difficulty accepting responsibility for his role in their problems. Danny's relationship with his latest girlfriend had ended shortly after he lost his job, when she realized that his charming lifestyle had been funded by a company expense account that no longer existed. He was now living in a small apartment, and learning to budget his money for the first time in his adult life. Part of me felt sympathy for them because that's what mothers do. We love our children even when they disappoint us, even when they hurt us, even when they need to learn difficult lessons the hard way. But I didn't rush to rescue them from the consequences of their choices because I had finally understood that rescuing them would be the same as enabling them to continue harmful behavior. Instead, I focused on building new relationships and rediscovering interests I had set aside during my years of playing the struggling widow. I took art classes at the Hartford Art School, something I had always wanted to do but had never made time for when I was focused on building my business and raising my children. I traveled to places Harold and I had always planned to visit together, but had postponed while we were focused on work and family responsibilities. I spent a month in Italy, exploring the countryside and learning about winemaking. I visited historical sites in Greece, walked through museums in Paris, and took a cooking class in Tuscany with other women my age who were rediscovering themselves after decades of putting others first. I volunteered with organizations that helped older women navigate financial independence, sharing my expertise in business and investment with women who were starting over after divorce or widowhood. It was deeply satisfying to use my knowledge and experience to help people who appreciated guidance and treated me with respect. The biggest surprise came in late spring, when Sarah graduated from high school and decided to spend the summer working as an intern at Hartwell Real Estate Holdings. She wanted to understand the business her grandmother had built, she said, and learn what it meant to create something meaningful from nothing. "Grandma," she said during her first week at the office, "I had no idea how big this company is. Dad always made it sound like just another real estate firm, but you own half the buildings downtown." "Not quite half," I laughed, "but we've been successful over the years. Your grandfather and I started with nothing but ideas and determination. Everything we built together." Working with Sarah reminded me why I had built the company in the first place. It wasn't about accumulating wealth or wielding power over others. It was about creating opportunities for families to find homes, providing jobs for people who needed them, and contributing something positive to the community where I had spent my entire adult life. Sarah approached the work with enthusiasm and curiosity, asking thoughtful questions about our development projects and showing genuine interest in the social impact of our business decisions. She was particularly drawn to our affordable housing initiatives, something that had become increasingly important to me as I watched Hartford struggle with the same housing challenges facing cities across the country. "Grandma," she said one afternoon as we reviewed plans for a new development that would include both market rate and subsidized housing, "I think I understand now why you did what you did with Dad and the uncles." "Oh," I replied, curious about her perspective after spending time in the professional environment where her father and uncles had worked. "They weren't treating you like family," she said thoughtfully. "They were treating you like a problem to be solved. But family means listening to each other and respecting each other's choices, doesn't it? Out of the mouths of babes, as they say." My granddaughter had grasped in a few months what her father and uncles still couldn't comprehend after a year of consequences. "Sarah," I said, "that's exactly right. Respect isn't something you give people because you have to. It's something you give because you value their thoughts and feelings and experiences. Your father and uncles forgot that somewhere along the way. Will they ever learn?" she asked. "I hope so," I replied honestly. "But that's their choice to make. I can't force them to change, and I can't protect them from the consequences of their actions. All I can do is decide how I want to be treated and stick to those standards." As summer turned to fall and the anniversary of my revelation approached, I found myself in a position I had never expected to occupy. I was genuinely happy with my life for the first time since Harold's death. I had rediscovered my own strength, built new relationships based on mutual respect, and learned that it was never too late to demand better treatment from the people in your life. The phone calls from my sons had become less frequent but more thoughtful over the months. They were beginning to understand that their apologies needed to be accompanied by changed behavior, not just words. Robert had started seeing a therapist to address his anger and control issues, though he still struggled with accepting responsibility for his actions. Michael was learning to manage stress without taking it out on subordinates, and his new job at the nonprofit was teaching him to value outcomes over appearances. Danny was working on developing genuine relationships instead of manipulative ones. Though old habits died hard, were they ready for reconciliation? Not yet. Were they making progress? Perhaps. Would I consider rebuilding our relationships if they demonstrated real change over time? Possibly. But those decisions would be made on my terms, with my dignity intact and my boundaries clearly established. The most important lesson I learned during that transformative year was that respect isn't automatic, even within families. It must be earned through consistent behavior, maintained through ongoing effort, and protected by setting clear consequences for those who violate it. I also learned that hiding your true self to test other people's motivations is a dangerous game that can reveal painful truths about the people closest to you. In my case, it exposed my son's true character, but it also robbed us all of 20 years of authentic relationship. If I could do it over again, I might choose a different path, though I'm not sure the outcome would have been any better. But life doesn't offer do-overs, only opportunities to make better choices going forward. And at 85, I can say with certainty that standing up for myself and demanding the respect I deserved was the right choice, even though it cost me the comfortable illusion that my sons loved me unconditionally. Today, as I tell you this story from my beautiful apartment overlooking the city where I built my life's work, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose dignity over acceptance, respect over comfort, and truth over the convenient lies we tell ourselves about family relationships. My sons may never fully understand what they put me through during those years when they treated me like a burden instead of a person who deserved their respect and consideration. But I understand, and that understanding has set me free to live the rest of my life on my own terms, surrounded by people who value me for who I am, rather than what they think they can get from me. That, my dear ones, is the sweetest revenge of all. Not destroying the people who hurt you, but refusing to let their treatment define your worth or limit your happiness. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply walking away from people who don't appreciate what you bring to their lives and finding others who do. Thank you so much for staying with me through this long journey. I hope my story touched your heart and maybe helped you think about the relationships in your own life. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. It helps us tremendously. Every day we bring you new emotional stories about life's challenges and triumphs. So feel free to explore and find your favorites. And most importantly, I want to hear from you. What did you think of my story? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in your own family? Tell us in the comments below. I read every single one. We'll see you tomorrow with another incredible story that I know will move your heart just as much as this one did.